Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today.
Yeah, definitely a deep dive.
You guys requested we take a closer look at the Angolan Civil War.
Lots to unpack there.
Seriously. You sent over a ton of material, and this is more than just your average war, right? I mean, 27 years.
Way more to it than meets the eye.
Yeah. I mean, you've got Cold War tensions, the Soviet Union's involved, Cuba, the U.S., even South Africa got pulled into it.
It all started as this fight for independence, but things escalated quickly, became a global issue.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. I think a lot of people, myself included, might not even know that much about Angola itself.
Right.
Like, it wasn't always Angola, was it? It was under Portuguese control for a long time.
Oh, yeah, for centuries, actually. And like a lot of colonial powers, Portugal wasn't exactly rushing to give up control.
But eventually, things started to change, right? I'm seeing stuff here about independence movements gaining traction.
Yeah, by the 1960s, these movements were getting pretty serious.
Ah.
And that's when the three main groups emerged: the MPLA, UNITA, and the FNLA.
Three groups, all fighting for an independent Angola. But I'm guessing they weren't exactly on the same page about what that would look like.
Definitely not a unified front. Big ideological differences between them. The MPLA, led by Agostinho Neto, leaned towards Marxism. They were aligned with the Soviet Union and Cuba.
Okay, so one group's got communist backing. What about the others?
Well, you had UNITA under Jonas Savimbi. They were getting support from the U.S. and South Africa.
Interesting. So already you've got this, like, split forming, setting the stage for a power struggle.
Exactly. And then there's the FNLA. They had some initial backing from Western powers, but they never really reached the same level as those first two.
Okay, so already, even before independence is officially on the table, there's tension.
Right.
You've got these different groups, different ideologies, all vying for control.
Definitely. And then in 1974, you have the Carnation Revolution in Portugal. This military coup totally changed the game, led to a rapid decolonization policy.
Wow. So Portugal essentially said, we're out.
Pretty much. They pulled out of their colonies, including Angola, and maybe a little too quickly.
No real transition plan in place, no structured handover of power.
Not really, and that created a perfect storm. Angola officially became independent on November 11th, 1975, which should have been a cause for celebration, but...
But instead, with no clear leadership, the country erupts into civil war almost immediately.
Exactly. All those simmering tensions boiled over, and this is where the Cold War context really kicks in.
Okay, so the Soviets were backing the MPLA. I saw in one of these articles they viewed them as a key ally in Africa.
Yeah, the Soviets saw this as a prime opportunity to spread their influence. Classic Cold War move.
And they really went all in, didn't they?
Yeah. Weapons, advisors, training, the whole nine yards.
Okay.
They were committed to helping the MPLA succeed.
And then you've got Cuba sending in a massive number of troops, right?
Yeah, over 36,000. Fidel Castro was all about supporting socialist movements around the world. Cuba's involvement was crucial for the MPLA, especially against UNITA and their allies.
So on one side, you've got the Soviets and Cubans backing the MPLA, and on the other side, you have the U.S. supporting UNITA.
Right.
It's like this big proxy war. But I'm guessing the U.S. wasn't just trying to counter the Soviets, right? There must have been something about UNITA specifically that appealed to U.S. interests.
Absolutely. It's way more complex than just countering the Soviets. The U.S. definitely saw UNITA as promoting policies that aligned with their own.
Okay, I'm seeing that here. UNITA's stance on things like economic liberalization and their strong anti-communist views, that would resonated with U.S. policymakers back then.
Right. It wasn't just about stopping the Soviets. There was also this sense of ideological compatibility with UNITA.
Makes sense. Then you've got South Africa entering the fray. Not a superpower in the same way, but they played a huge role.
Right.
What was their motivation?
South Africa was under apartheid at the time, and they saw the MPLA as a direct threat.
Because of their Marxist leanings, right? And because the MPLA supported anti-apartheid movements.
Exactly. Plus, South Africa had their own regional ambitions. They wanted to prevent the spread of communism in southern Africa.
So a lot of reasons for them to get involved. And they didn't just, offer moral support. They were actively involved in the fighting.
Oh, yeah. They sent troops to fight alongside UNITA, launched incursions into Angola. They were deep in the mix, coordinating with UNITA and, get this, receiving support from the CIA.
Wait, the CIA was involved too? Wow. So this is a proxy war, but the level of involvement from outside powers is pretty mind-blowing.
It was a tangled web for sure. The CIA funneled millions of dollars, weapons, training to UNITA. often working with South Africa to counter those Soviet and Cuban efforts.
So much going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, a lot of this stuff remained classified for years. It was a messy situation, all driven by these competing interests.
Okay, so we've got these factions in Angola, superpowers using them as pawns in their Cold War rivalry, and South Africa pursuing their own agenda.
A lot of moving pieces.
It's a lot to take in, but I think we've laid out the groundwork. Now, let's dive into how the conflict actually played out on the ground.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've got the stage set, we know who the players are, and the Cold War is looming over everything. What happened next? What were those early days of the war like?
Right after independence, late 1975 into 76, the fighting was intense. The MPLA, with Cuban troops and Soviet backing, they actually managed to take control of most of the country.
Including Luanda, the capital?
Yep, Luanda too. But UNITA and their allies, they didn't just give up, you know?
They put up a fight.
Oh, absolutely. With support from South Africa and the U.S., UNITA retreated into the countryside and shifted tactics.
So instead of big battles, it became more of a guerrilla war, hit-and-run tactics, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It was brutal and incredibly difficult for civilians who were caught in the crossfire. Millions of people were displaced, forced to flee their homes.
It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, the Cold War maneuvering. But ultimately, it's the everyday people who suffer the most.
Absolutely. There's a really powerful source you send over, a diary entry from a young woman who had to flee her village during this time. She talks about hiding in the bush for days, terrified, not knowing where her family was.
Wow.
It really puts a human face on the conflict.
It's heartbreaking. Okay, so the war drags on, and then in the 1980s, things start to escalate.
Right. The Cold War was heating up globally, and that spilled over into Angola. Both the U.S. and the Soviets upped their support, sending more weapons, more resources, more advisors. Essentially, they were pouring fuel on the fire.
And wasn't this around the time of the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale? That seems like a really significant event.
Absolutely. The Battle of Cuito Cuanavale from 87 to 88 was a major turning point. It was one of the largest conventional battles in Africa since World War II. Cuban and MPLA forces against South African and UNITA troops.
Wow. What was the outcome?
It was a decisive victory for the Cuban and MPLA forces. They stopped the South African advance and inflicted some serious damage.
So a major setback for South Africa.
Huge. It really forced them to reconsider their involvement, and it pushed them towards the negotiating table.
So it wasn't just a military victory, it had political repercussions as well.
Right. And by this point, even the Cold War itself was winding down. The Soviet Union was under a lot of pressure. And on both sides, the appetite for these proxy wars was fading.
It's interesting how those global shifts played out in Angola.
Yeah. There was growing international pressure for a peaceful solution. That eventually led to the Bices Accords in 1991, a ceasefire, and the promise of democratic elections.
After decades of fighting, it sounds like there was finally a real chance for peace.
There was hope, for sure. People were exhausted from the war. Everyone wanted a future without violence and displacement. But as we know, peace can be fragile.
So did the Bices Accords actually work? Did they lead to lasting peace?
Sadly, no. The elections were held in 1992. The MPLA, now led by José Eduardo dos Santos, they won.
Right.
But Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA, he rejected the results, claimed there was fraud, refused to accept defeat.
After a ceasefire, a taste of peace, the country plunges back into war.
Yeah, it was a huge blow. UNITA took up arms again, and Angola was back in a state of conflict. But things are different this time.
How so?
Well, the Cold War was over, and UNITA was finding itself increasingly isolated internationally.
I can see how that would change the game.
South Africa, post-apartheid, they pulled back their support. And the U.S., while still a bit wary of the MPLA, they were more focused on stability in the region and started pressuring Savimbi to negotiate.
So even though the fighting restarted, the whole landscape had shifted. UNITA was losing its allies.
Exactly.
So how did this final chapter of the war play out?
The fighting went on for another 10 years, more brutality, more guerrilla warfare. It was a dark period for Angola, a country that desperately needed to heal. But things were turning against UNITA.
The resources were drying up.
Yeah, and they were facing a much stronger, more determined Angolan army. The real turning point came in 2002.
What happened?
Jonas Savimbi was killed in a battle with Angolan government forces.
Wow. The leader of UNITA, that must have been a huge blow.
It was. It created a leadership vacuum. And really, it seemed to break UNITA's will to fight. Later that same year, they agreed to a peace deal with the government.
After 27 years, the Angolan Civil War was finally over.
It was. but the cost was immense.
I can only imagine. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. The country was in ruins.
It's estimated that somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people died during the war. And the impact went far beyond that, of course. Millions displaced, infrastructure destroyed, and a whole generation traumatized by the violence.
It's hard to even fathom the scale of the suffering. Okay, so we've talked about the war itself, but what about the aftermath? What happened to Angola once the fighting stopped? It's hard to even imagine, starting over after that much destruction. 27 years of civil war. Where do you even begin to rebuild?
It's a massive undertaking, and there's no easy answer. Angola was, and still is, facing some serious challenges. Poverty, inequality, trauma, it's all part of the war's legacy.
Yeah, and you mentioned millions of people displaced. The economy was in shambles. And then there's the landmines. Oh, the landmines. A constant deadly reminder of the conflict, even after it's officially over.
That must have made rebuilding daily life even incredibly dangerous.
Absolutely. Landmines don't discriminate. They kill and maim long after the fighting stops. People can't return home, can't farm their land, can't even move freely without the risk of these hidden explosives. And clearing them, that's a whole other challenge, right? I imagine it's slow and dangerous work.
It is. It's a long, painstaking process. And Angola is still dealing with this issue today.
It's just another layer of the war's impact. And it wasn't just Angola that was affected, was it? The war had a ripple effect throughout the region.
You're right. The whole southern African region was destabilized. The conflict spilled over into neighboring countries, Namibia, Zambia, even the Democratic Republic of Congo.
So the superpowers, they might have moved on, but the region was left to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the responsibility of these outside powers. They intervened, often under the banner of freedom or democracy, but did they really grasp the long-term effects of their actions?
The Angolan people were the ones left picking up the pieces.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about a lot of the negative consequences of the war, but were there any positive outcomes that came out of this?
Well, it's important to note that as devastating as it was, the Angolan Civil War actually played a role in ending apartheid in South Africa.
Really? How so?
The Battle of Cuito Cuanavale that we talked about earlier, that was a turning point for the apartheid regime. Their defeat at the hands of the Cubans and MPLA, it really weakened them militarily and in terms of their international standing.
So the Angolan Civil War, in a way, contributed to ending apartheid. Wow.
It did. The South African withdrawal from Angola, it was a big step towards the dismantling of apartheid. It's a complex legacy. It reminds us that these conflicts, they can have far-reaching and often unforeseen consequences.
Yeah. As we're talking about all of this, it just strikes me how interconnected everything is. The Angolan Civil War, it was a local conflict, but it became a stage for global power struggles.
Yeah.
This proxy war fueled by Cold War tensions. And then the impact spreads throughout Southern Africa and even beyond.
You hit the nail on the head. The world is interconnected. What seems like a distant event can have huge effects on everything else. It really highlights how important it is to understand history in all its complexity, not just as isolated events, but as this tapestry of interconnected threads.
And history isn't just the past, right? It shapes the present and the future. So what can we learn from all of this? What lessons can we take from the Angolan Civil War and apply to the world today?
Well, for me, one of the biggest takeaways is the danger of proxy wars. Turning local conflicts into these battlegrounds for global powers, it has devastating consequences.
Yeah.
The Angolan Civil War is a stark reminder of the human cost of these interventions.
And I think it's a reminder that we can't oversimplify things, We can't just view these conflicts through the lens of ideology or national interest. We have to remember the human stories, the lives impacted, the long-term consequences of our actions.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of things like diplomacy, conflict resolution, addressing the root causes of these conflicts rather than just reacting to the symptoms. Hopefully, by learning from the past, we can create a future where conflicts like this don't happen again.
Well, this has been an incredibly informative deep dive, and honestly, pretty sobering, too. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this complex and often overlooked part of history.
It's been my pleasure. And as we've seen, understanding the past, it can really help us make sense of the present and maybe even help us build a more peaceful future.
And to everyone listening, we hope this encourages you to dig a little deeper, to learn more about the Angolan Civil War and what it means for us today. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's a story about human experience. And it's a story that continues to shape our world.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep diving deep.